how do you as a man trust yourself if you don't trust men? What you're really saying is, I don't trust myself as a man.
Today, we're talking with Connor Beaton, founder of Man Talks and author of the best-selling book, Men's Work.
Young boys are growing up without any real modeling or transmission of mature masculinity. We recognized that an uninitiated man is actually a danger to the culture and the community. In order to heal the wounds that you have from men, you have to largely get in the arena with other men to disprove those old stories.
Connor's dedicated his career to helping men lead themselves and their relationships more effectively, and he's brought that message to stages worldwide, from TEDx to the United Nations.
And this is what a lot of men get caught in. They're ruminating in their minds constantly about all the things that they want to change or control or influence that they can't do anything about. There's no such thing as toxic masculinity. A lot of men find value in being able to embody these more masculine traits, and there's nothing wrong with that.
If you're ready to do the inner work that actually creates lasting change in your life and leadership, this conversation is a powerful place to start.
Connor, been looking forward to this one, man. I've been loving leaning into your work, reading Men's Work, part of the Alliance, and you're somebody that I have a deep respect for in the way that you show up, in the way that you lead. There's an authenticity that I feel that I think is deeply needed in these times. There's something in you, how you show up and how you lead, that feels very trustworthy. So you've been a really wonderful mentor and somebody that has shaped part of the work that I do and how I show up. And on that note, I wanted to kick this off with something you actually said in your most recent email, that self-worth is the reward of a man who refuses to abandon himself through lies. Say more about that.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying in terms of, how I show up is somebody who's trustworthy, because that was not the case for a very long time. And as a consequence of that, we could, it's sort of the chicken and the egg for, chicken and the egg thing. It's like, which one came first, the lack of self-worth or, deep self and relational betrayal? But I struggled to have any kind of self-worth, and I struggled to feel like who I was as a man had value. And I could probably point to a number of things that were leading to that caused my life to sort of implode at some point. One of them was, I did have some parts of my childhood that were pretty rough. Experiencing verbal and emotional abuse, physical abuse, separation of family, not really feeling like I belonged, bouncing back and forth between two family systems. I think that played into it. And then, this sort of notion of, I wrote about this in my book, that a lot of us as men buy into this belief that you gain strength through emotional suppression, that the more you just stuff shit down and drink Jack Daniels and smoke weed and watch porn and have sex and, get another conquest, another notch in the belt, the more that you'll be able to feel strong psychologically and emotionally. And I really tried that to its max, and it did not work. It would sort of numb things out for a little while, but underneath that was this sort of, I don't like myself. I don't feel like I have any real purpose or meaning or direction. I didn't like who I was, and I was just generally sort of lying all the time. And that had an impact on my perception of my worth as a man, because any man who is living a life that is riddled with lies, with fabrications, any man that's living a life that isn't aligned with a deeper sense of integrity for himself and his values, it's going to erode his sense of worth as a man. And it's going to get in his way of being able to contribute to the things that actually matter to him in the world, whatever that is, whether that's an artistic contribution, it's a contribution in the work environment or a family, whatever that is, it's going to get in the way of him being able to do that. So that's sort of in part what I was speaking to with that email.
Yeah, I feel that and relate to all the ways that I've chased those quick dopamine hits to deal with the pain even of lying to myself, and that whole of the self-worth that I've struggled with. And I'm curious from your perspective, like as a man starts saying the things that he doesn't want to, as he starts speaking to the truth. Obviously, there's a huge truth between, or a link between truth and self worth. What changes for this man, both like internally and relationally?
A number of things happen. I mean, Jung, if Carl Jung was on the call, he'd probably say something along the lines of, he was sort of renowned for saying that the first step in any therapeutic or spiritual process is confession. And so, in some ways, it doesn't matter if you are religious or not. If you are going to take any type of psychological um, journey or emotional journey where you're trying to develop a deeper level of strength psychologically or emotionally, you are going to have to cop to and take ownership of the shit that you've been doing that's out of alignment and integrity, because that's one of the only ways back into alignment and integrity, right? It's just being able to own the things that you have been dishonest about. And because when you lie, there's this real erosion that starts to happen both within yourself and your relationships. And so your self perception starts to erode. It actually fragments your psyche, and it starts to fragment your ego, and it starts to fragment your sense of identity. So you can actually never have a full coherent sense of self through lying, through whether it's lies of omission or embellishment or direct lies or whatever it is. If you're going to go down that pathway, it's going to continue to fragment your sense of self. Now, eventually, if you go far enough down that pathway, your psyche and your identity and your ego will find coherence, but it'll be around that center, that sort of centrifuge of dishonesty, of lacking coherence. And this is where a lot of men find themselves, right? They're at rock bottom because so much of their life has been spent pursuing what other people have told them they should do, pursuing what other people value, disconnecting from their own values, their own traits, their own characteristics that they hold near and dear, not being honest with themselves or others. And all of a sudden, their sense of self has become so fragmented. And so, really, the way I like to look at it is that mental health and mental strength and mental well being is about coherence and flexibility. It's those two things. It's a kind of structure and flexibility. So the coherent part of it, if you want to find any type of alignment within yourself or strength or fortitude within your own psyche or your sense of self and identity, it's going to come through doing the hard thing of speaking the truth, whatever that might be, whether it's about your actions, your needs, your wants, your desires. It's about being honest about those things, because in some ways it's you taking your internal experience and making it manifest into the world. And if you don't do that, you continue to negate the truth that is inside of you, that you continue to negate your internal experience, whether that's a want or a need or a desire, right? And men do this all the time, right? This is like people pleaser 101, nice guy 101. I'm going to ignore what I need and want. I'm going to prioritize other people's needs and wants. Hopefully my needs will get met eventually. And what happens is they turn into, sometimes they turn into to men that are really, they have a lot of animosity or a lot of rage and hidden anger. They have a lot of passive aggressiveness towards the people in their life. They're chronically disappointed. So we have to be able to start to find coherence through honesty. And then we can have some mental flexibility. Then we can start to develop flexibility by doing a myriad of things, right? Like not actually focusing in on the things that we don't have any influence over or control over. And part of the reason, I'm just going to zoom way out for 1 second. I'll come back to an individual here and then I'll pause. One of the main reasons why we see so much mental dis-ease and unwellness within people in today's culture is that they are chronically being shown, one, more information, data, and people's individual experience than they can actually harvest or know what to do with, right? Like it used to be, you'd walk through the day to day and you'd interact with 2 or 3 people or 10 people or 20 people. What we're not used to is scrolling through social media for an hour and interacting with thousands of people's consciousness and unconscious minds, their fears, their projections, etc. And then when you couple that with being chronically shown, just continually shown every single day, a whole bunch of massive geopolitical, social issues that you as an individual literally can do nothing about, it puts you in this state of helplessness, of fear, of worry, of anxiety. And so a lot of people are just stuck in that state. And what ends up happening is they fall into this psychological trap that we know creates suffering. And that psychological trap is very simple. When you as an individual try to change or influence or alter things that you do not have control or influence over, you will suffer. And this is what a lot of men get caught in. They're ruminating in their minds constantly about all the things that they want to change or control or influence that they can't do anything about. The government or what's happening overseas or a war or, some politician that said something, and they literally can't do anything about it. But most of their mental and cognitive payload on a day-to-day basis is going towards this kind of, mental masturbation and constant rumination about how to solve this shit that they can't do anything about. And it's crippling a lot of people. So we have to start to return to what are the things that I actually can influence in my life, and to let go of those things that we actually just have no direct control or influence over. So I'll pause there.
I love that, man. I actually spent 8 years in the public education system. So I saw it, firsthand at a young age, where asking to go to the bathroom, asking to, can I have permission to do this, or look outside of you for what is true, what is right, to be the good boy. So that conditioning, be it at school or at home, does start at a young age. And it is a process of reclamation. It's honestly shocking the amount of men I work with that I'll ask, what do you want? And they can come on some far out intellectualized idea of it, but not even clear on
Yeah.
what do I want and what is my direction that I'm going. And as I was listening to you speak, the word that was coming through was agency. And I think so many people lack that sense of agency in their lives. And particularly with the noise that we have, and not able to handle all of these problems, and the ability to discern, what is within my realm of control and what is not mine. What tasks are not mine, that are somebody else's, that are something else, and what can I do that's here in front of me. And I think that's a big part of maturity, is
Mm.
that discernment, to be able to know what is mine here, what is mine to do, what is mine to deal with. And I think it correlates a lot with what you talk about with this rise of the man child. It's been something that you have been speaking about quite a bit lately. What are you seeing with this rise of the man child?
Yeah, I mean, there was an archetype that Jung talked about, and one of his proteges ended up sort of going into, called the puer aeternus, and the puer aeternus just means the eternal boy. And this isn't a new archetype. It's not some. I mean, it's something that has always been around. That it's existed throughout human history. It's in different myths. It's in the Bible. It's kind of everywhere, because we all know how unfortunate, how challenging it is to be a man who never really crosses the threshold from boy to men, right? And so, and I see this all the time with men who are like, yeah, I'm a 45-year-old guy, or I'm a 60-year-old man, and I still feel like I'm, a kid. I feel like I have all this responsibility, but I feel woefully ill-equipped for it. And so the puer aeternus is an archetype that symbolizes the man that never really wants to grow up. And I talk about this from a place of deeply understanding it, because that was me for a very long time. I've joked around in the past that there's like this 500-pound fat man inside of me that just wants to play video games and smoke weed all day and do fucking nothing. Like that's there. And I think that that's there inside of a lot of men that want to escape responsibility. And there's there's some sort of key markers around the eternal boy or the puer aeternus and this sort of rise of the man child that I think is important. Number one, we are living in one of the highest rates in human history, as far as I can tell, of fatherless homes, of young children, but specifically young boys, growing up without a father figure in their life. And in America, in the United States, it's 1 in 4 kids that will grow up without a father figure in their household. Now, when you dig into that data, what you'll find is that that fatherless household will disproportionately affect young boys way more than young girls. Young girls will have a much higher likelihood of teenage pregnancies and, maybe dropping out of school. But for young boys, it is catastrophic. It is so devastating. It's astounding. You start to see like 8 times higher rates of school dropouts, 9 times higher rates of incarceration. Behavioral disorders skyrocket. It's like 80% of young kids that have behavioral disorders you can track to fatherless households, right? So across the board, incarceration, teenage pregnancy, all of the metrics where we look at a young boy and say that young boy is struggling, all of those metrics start to just absolutely skyrocket. So there's that piece of it, but there's the other piece, which is that becoming a man and crossing that threshold between boy and manhood, between being a boy and being a man, doesn't really fully happen. And so we have a lot of boys that are growing up in environments where they don't have male role models. They don't have a father present. They go through an education system that's dominated by women, right? 80 to 85% of teachers, depending on where you grew up, it's going to be women. They get into a college place that's dominated by women, right? So for every one male that graduates from college now, there will be 2 women that graduate from college. So we are inverse of what it was like in 1960s. College professors are becoming more and more female, and then if you want to get help and talk about that, you enter into a therapeutic field where 75% of therapists are women. And so there's this massive vacancy of male role models that are teaching other men, teaching other boys what it looks like to be a man, how to deal with the challenges of being a man, talking about the practicalities of being good at being a man, and what can bring you joy and fulfillment and purpose and meaning. So there's kind of this big vacancy where young boys are growing up without any real modeling or transmission of mature masculinity. There's no real transmission of mature masculinity. You don't see it in Hollywood or TV shows. You don't really see it in and around you. And so when you couple that with the reality that a lot of young men look out at society and they see a couple of things. Number one, they see it's very unlikely that I'm going to do better than my parents. That's just the state of the economy right now. Most young people know that they are going to have a hard time doing better than their parents, which has not been the case for the last 150 years, 200 years. They look out at a culture and a society as young men, and what they see is a kind of vitriol and hatred towards men and masculinity, right? If you would look at some of the narratives around modern masculinity, and you see things like, the patriarchy is the problem for everything. I call it the patriarchy virus, right? Everything, any problem in modern existence, depending on who you talk to, is going to get brought back to, well, if we just dismantled the patriarchy, we wouldn't be having this problem. And young boys and young men are seeing that, and they're like, well, you're telling me that I'm part of the patriarchy. I am certainly not benefiting from this. In modern cities, in the West, especially in the United States, women are actually now, if you're under 40, women are starting to out earn men in major metropolitan areas. They are buying houses more than men. So men are really starting to fall behind. And so part of this is social. There's a kind of social collapse around wanting men to be a part of society or seeing the value that men bring to culture and society. And then there's a vacancy of mature masculinity and mature masculine role models. And then there's a kind of incentivization that has happened through, a few generations of parenting where we have coddled children. And this is really detrimental for young men, because what ends up happening is that young boys never really learn how to take healthy risks. And that is absolutely catastrophic to the masculine psyche. And it is catastrophic to a man who part of his desire and part of his functionality in the world is to be able to go out into the world and take meaningful risks, and to be assertive while doing those things, and to be firm, and to have direction. And so if you have been raised to avoid risk, to be risk averse, and to just be in these online spaces and not really know how to socialize and approach women, or these sort of basic things, you're just naturally going to be at a disadvantage. And so I think a lot of young men, rightfully so, they feel dejected from society. They feel rejected from society and culture. They feel like they are undersupported in terms of the institutions and the systems that we've built. And it's sad, because I think when you look at having a conversation about some of these things to address the issues that a lot of young boys and a lot of men are facing, all of a sudden it's like, well, you're anti-women. It's like, no, 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 no. These two things can coexist. We can solve women's issues while also talking about the issues that men and boys are facing. So that's sort of the social individual piece of it. I know that's, a lot. I just threw a lot at you. So I'll pause there and let you do with that what you will.
It's good stuff, man. And I think you're bang on a lot of these pieces, like particularly the fatherless home crisis that we're seeing. And even the ones like, that's not even to mention those who grow up with a father that's physically present but emotionally absent, which, also leaves a massive gap. I don't recall my father ever verbalizing an emotion that he's ever felt. So, I could feel it in my body, right? But never actually knowing what's going on. I'm curious, with this rise of toxic masculinity, this kind of, attack on, well, masculinity itself is toxic. And my personal belief, where I've come to land now as it evolves, is I think what they're pointing to, there's something real there, but the words itself is lacking. It's lacking something, because I don't think masculinity or femininity are toxic. I think they're both sacred and natural expressions of who we are. But I think what a lot of people see when they look for a man is they find an adolescent, they find the man child. And I'd love for you to just make a case on why developing, or what does a healthy sense of masculinity actually look like, and why is that important for us as individuals and societally?
Well, why it's important for us individually and societally is we can't, as much as parts of culture would like, we can't eradicate categories. You can't, just because you don't like categories or hierarchies doesn't mean that they don't serve a function and a purpose. And this has become a very sort of postmodernist approach to dialogue when it comes to men and women, of disliking binaries and disliking categories and disliking hierarchies and seeing those as all evil or part of the patriarchy, or whatever it is. And so I think historically, we as men, uh, we have done a good job of creating order. We have done a decent job of propelling our species forward through some pretty massive challenges. Um, we've also done a shitty job of not protecting the species as a whole, and sometimes prioritizing power and war and those types of things. Um, what was the initial question, though? I feel like I'm veering off. I feel like I'm veering off from what you were asking.
Yeah, just what is a case for healthy masculinity? Like, what does that provide when?
Right. Toxic masculinity, health. So I'm, there's a great philosopher, Zizek, and he's kind of taken a stance against this sort of like notion of toxic masculinity.
Mm,
I've always said there's no such thing as toxic masculinity. There are men who have unhealthy behaviors and traits, but masculinity and femininity, um, they are amoral things, right? They are just their definitions, their structures. They're not inherently toxic. That's just an ideology. And so I really buck against this notion. And I think the problem is that the modern psychological institutions have adopted this, right? The American Psychology Association talked about how traditional masculinity on a whole is harmful, and it puts men in a disadvantage. And it's really sort of talking down about these sort of core principles and tenets that a lot of men honestly find value in. A lot of men find value in being able to do simple things like provide, like protect their families, like being assertive, being somewhat unapologetic, having direction in life, being able to make, the person that is the decision maker. A lot of men find value in being able to embody these more masculine traits. And there's nothing wrong with that. So I think that this notion that masculinity is inherently toxic, or that parts of masculinity are toxic, the real problem that I have with it is that the people that say, you know, toxic masculinity, what ends up happening is that they list out a whole bunch of behaviors that they say these things are all toxic. And when you ask them to define any type of healthy masculinity, they can't do it. When you ask them to define masculinity, they can't do it. When you ask them to define who are men that embody masculinity that you would approve of, they can't do it. And so so this is the sort of paradox and the challenge that a lot of men have, is that on one side of the equation, masculinity is not definable, is completely elusive, and if it is to be defined, it's defined through all the things that you should not do. Don't do this laundry list of things and maybe you'll be a good man. That does not create direction. That does not create aspiration. That does not create something that you can embody. It just is a shame-based way of trying to gain some type of compliance over people. That's a problem. We should never allow that. Shame is this interesting tool that has become really embedded into our culture and used to have people comply to an ideology or to back down from speaking about certain things. It's a really interesting part of the culture that we live in right now. So I buck against traditional or the toxic masculinity. Mature masculinity is some of the things that I was talking about before. For a lot of men, it's going to be about being able to provide something, whether that's financially for a family, whether it's a skill set to a community or a business, being able to protect things that matter, right? The notion of a country, the notion of a family system, the being able to protect people in your life, whether that's physically or emotionally or mentally. Those things matter to a lot of men that are mature. And then you have other traits like being able to be assertive, being able to sometimes be unapologetic, right? For a lot of men, a lot of guys will have experienced this if they're a people pleaser or a nice guy. You live in this state of sort of chronically trying to gain approval from other people by apologizing for what you actually need and want. So you never actually say, here are the things that I need and want in this relationship or in this working environment. And it's all of this covert way of trying to be that undercuts your sense of self. So what you're really doing in those moments is you're devaluing your own needs. You're saying my needs don't really matter, my wants don't really matter, my desires don't really matter. I'm going to put those aside. So part of mature masculinity is being willing to be disliked. Not everybody is meant to like you. Not everybody is meant to agree with you. That is okay. And then being able to maintain relationship with people that you disagree with, right? So being able to go through a hard time, come out the other side okay with people in your relationship, that's also very important. So these are some of the basic sort of tenets and principles that for a lot of men will signify mature masculinity. And then finally, I did this whole episode on Aragorn and mature masculinity, and talked about the notion that the real king is not a tyrant. It's not somebody that goes to war. The real king is somebody who embodies everything that I just talked about, but also has what's called the healing hands, right? The willingness to support people in a way that's not necessarily about them as an individual, right? So it's not about you as a man, that you are contributing to something, you are in service to something that is greater than you. And part of that service is about being able to help and support others.
Mm.
And I think for a lot of men, this is what's missing in their life. And it's the step of maturation that many of us actually need and require. But because we've never experienced that from an elder, we've never experienced that from another man who loved us or supported us through a really hard time, there's a kind of deep distrust of the masculine that lives inside of so many men that says it's not safe for me to get support from another man. It's not safe for me to be transparent with another man or honest about where I'm suffering and where I'm struggling. And so we end up carrying this very deep pain inside of us that that doesn't have anywhere to go. And so it destroys us and our lives. So that's sort of the last piece of the sort of hallmark of mature masculinity, is this willingness to serve something greater than yourself, this willingness to help and heal. That's incredibly important.
Mm. I love that, man. And that episode on Aragorn was was excellent. Um, I also really agree that, just want to highlight and double down on that piece around maturity. I think I'd even take that further. Like, anytime a man is looking outside of himself for approval from someone or something, that's a sign of a lack of maturity. I I think really I'm coming to learn and to be able to check in with myself about what is true for me, and being able to be okay in all the moments that that disapproval is going to be there. Inevitably, that's I think an indicator that at some point you're following your own path. And I think that course correct is, as you said, in service to something greater. And one thing that was coming up as you were talking about that was like elderhood, mentorship, initiation, which, if you look across cultures throughout millennia, like that's been established in cultures everywhere. And I'm curious from your perspective, because I haven't actually heard this talked about that much, but like, why do you think real initiation has vanished for modern men? And what has that void left us with?
It's hard to point to any one thing um, that has stripped that away. I think you could look at things like World War II,
Mm,
World War One, World War II, where initiation was just through war and blood, and there was a lot of young men that, you know, 18 years old, 19. I mean, my grandfather signed up at 18 or 19 years old to go and fight in World War II. And that's a brutal initiation into manhood. And it's not one that isn't without trauma, a deep pain. It's not really contained. It actually misses a lot of the, the sort of pillars or aspects that create initiation. Like, real initiation is about being taken out of your homeostasis, your normal life, taken out of the home of your mother, of your father, and brought into this type of experience where you have to confront something larger than yourself, right? So it's really this encounter with the unknown, with the unconscious. And it's a question of whether or not you will survive that encounter with this thing that is greater than you. So
mm,
Richard Rohr, he's a great Franciscan monk. He said, unless a man goes on a journey of powerlessness, he will always abuse power. And so that's really the sort of crux of what initiation is meant to do. It's meant to put you in a confrontation, in an experience where you are face to face with powerlessness, where who you are as a man when you are powerless. Now, we've taken that out of our cultures because of a bunch of series of events, right? World War II, the Industrial Revolution. It became um, it became more important for us as men to simply produce than it did for us to be functioning members of society. So we became units of production instead of members of a culture, members of a society. So you don't need an initiated man whose aim throughout his life is to become an elder. You don't need an initiated man who's wise, who's questioning power systems. You don't need an initiated man who is, looking at a fairness, looking at equality, looking at these types of things. You don't need those types of men within your culture and society if what you really need is a whole bunch of men that can just produce and
Mm.
output. And so we turned men largely into production units and and took initiation out of the process, because a 50-year-old man child can put ice cream handles onto ice cream buckets. That's no problem, right? It doesn't matter, right? He can work in gravel pits and build sidewalks, and he doesn't need to be initiated. He can just go do all those things. He can work in factories. He can work in the Amazon shop or deliver the mail or whatever, right? He doesn't have to be initiated. It's not a requirement anymore. When you lived with 100 to 150 people in a village and everyone had to sort of coexist and get along, it was much more important, because we recognized that an uninitiated man is actually a danger to the culture and the community, right? He's a danger to the culture and the community. Why? Because he doesn't have a couple things. One, he doesn't have a right relationship to risk, as we were talking about before. So an uninitiated man, far more likely to take really wild, really stupid risks that will cause either harm to him or harm to the people around him, right? And I did this growing up too, right? I was uninitiated. I didn't know what I was doing. I bought a 1,000cc motorcycle, at 19 years old, wheeling down the highway at like 150 kilometers, like just doing stupid shit that put myself and other people in danger. That's just one example, right? And this is what happens, and we've known this. We know this, right? And you see this all the time in cities all over the Western world and all over the world in general, where uninitiated men are the ones that take the big risks. The second thing is what I was talking about with the Richard Rohr quote, which is that uninitiated men are far more likely to abuse power. They are
Mm.
far more likely to seek out positions of power to try and disprove the internal knowing that they are not mature, that they are uninitiated. And so an uninitiated man will be much more likely to seek out a position of power to try and disprove the insecurity that he has around his own masculine maturity inside of him. And most men feel that, and they find themselves in a position for a Fortune 500 company or working for some stock trading company, whatever it is, right? And what they experience is this kind of running from their own insecurity and immaturity that lives inside of them. So I don't think that there's necessarily one reason why we've taken it away, but I think that the impact of strip mining initiation out of our culture is very apparent. It's very, very apparent, because there are a lot of men who do not want to take responsibility for their life, who do not have a right relationship with risk, who don't have a good relationship with power. They are either completely avoidant and adverse to their own sense of potency within themselves, and that has its own ramifications, or they are running wild, sort of drunk off of their own power and seeking more and more and more of it endlessly.
Mm. Yeah, I 100%. And it's interesting, even on the flip side of what you said, I think the initiated man is a stabilizing force in family, in community, and even beyond that. I would say that they're a danger to the status quo. They're a danger to institutional power, because they're not seeking it outside of themselves and they're not projecting it somewhere else. So I think I'm sure there's other reasons why it's beneficial for at least the status quo to remain as it is, to not have initiated men.
Well, I'll just say one more thing on
Yeah.
that, which is uninitiated men are far easier to gain compliance from. So they are much more likely to just say yes to
Mm.
whatever happens. And uninitiated men are also much more likely, they're much easier to control. whether that's, and when I say control, I'm not, and or I'm say compliance, just notice I'm not making a political statement about left or right, because I can already hear people interpreting that from like, oh, he's talking about liberals or he's talking about conservatives. No, this is on both sides of the equation. All right. Men that are uninitiated are much more easy to gain compliance from, and they are much easier to control because they just kind of flop with where things are, like what they're told, with what people are telling them to believe. There's not really a lot of self-reflection or critical thinking. There's no real process that they've gone through of having an elder pass down any type of real generational wisdom that has existed. Right, there are truths that live outside of the institutions and systems that we have currently. But if you've never experienced that, you don't really, like, you don't know what you don't know. So you don't
Right.
know that it exists, right? And myth is a good example of that. Myths hold truths that are larger than you can put in some Instagram meme, right? Or some Instagram quote or some TikTok quote. So there's wisdom there that can be passed down. So I think in many ways, uninitiated men are beneficial to those who are in power, have status, because they don't really question things. They don't really push back. They kind of go along with what they're told, or they're very easy to rally towards one side or the other. And in our culture right now, there is this war that is happening for the hearts and the minds of men, especially young men. There's a war happening for the hearts and the minds of young men. And they're being rallied to a kind of battle, because when wars are fought, who fights them? It's always men, right? It's men that go to war. And so you can always tell when a society is really disrupted based on the narratives that are trying to put men into camps, right? Not physical camps, but putting them into ideological, socio-narrative camps of whose side are you on? And right now, that is more apparent than ever. We've never, in my lifetime at
Mm.
least, I've never seen it this bad, where it's whose side are you on? And it takes mature men to stand up and say, I mean, I was going to swear, but I was going to say, like, fuck both those sides.
Yeah.
Like, don't fall for that. Don't fall for the trap, right? Because that is consistently what happens throughout human history, is rallying men to war. And it's, yeah, I'll pause there. My rant is
No,
done.
man, you're you're spot on, and it's just perpetuating tribalism, and I think it's a shallow way to find belonging. And I think even again from a young age, we've sacrificed belonging from the in the family and the community for fitting in with
Hmm.
whatever ideology, whatever camp you're talking about, to fit in. And all of a sudden we drift from our values, we drift from that connection to something greater, to serving the family. Again, it really serves such a destabilizing idea here. It's like, okay, well, if everybody's just kind of warring and squabbling with one another rather than rallying and unifying towards something larger, and we could take that even down to a microcosm in the family, bringing direction. Where are we moving towards as a couple, as a family? What are we moving towards something bigger? As a man who struggled with commitment my entire life, or thought I did, I've come to realize that I never actually had a vision that I was leading my relationship toward. I was never
Hmm.
stewarding towards anything greater. And I think we could expand that to a cultural level and, even broader. I, I think a man who doesn't know what he stands for will fall for anything.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what we see a lot of within the modern culture today,
Mm,
within the modern culture conversation around men. And it's easier to enlist men into your cause if they're lost, they're confused, they're fatherless, they don't have a role model, they've never been through any type of healthy initiatory experience. All they know is hazing from fraternities,
mm.
and sort of preying on this notion of just stuff it down and don't talk about it and don't feel it, and you're the problem with absolutely everything. So I think there's a lot of pressure that is put on men, both psychologically and emotionally, that is causing them, extreme duress within today's society and culture. And I think part of what we're doing is offering a non-political secular space where men can develop those leadership skills. Like, how do you actually mature as a man? We need more spaces that are reaching out and offering training, pathways, processes where you as a man can start to mature and you can learn shoulder to shoulder alongside other men. Like Terence McKenna, the sort of great psychonaut, said we need an archaic revival. And
Mm,
part of this is about not that we need to go back to some way of being, but that we can reach back into structures and processes that have actually supported the maturation of men throughout human history. And we can use those processes in a modern context to actually support men in their maturation. Because I've never met a woman in my life that says, nah, we don't need more mature men. Like, nah, get those mature men away from me. Right. They're like dying for them. They're like,
mm,
where are the mature men? Because in a lot of ways, what they're meeting is not that. And for men as well, it is exponentially more rewarding and more fulfilling to be able to trust yourself, to be able to rely on yourself, to have respect for yourself than to fucking hate yourself and to hate the direction of your life and to feel like you're completely out of control. And so that's what this process is really all about. That's what we are needing more of in our culture. And we need more spaces that are creating opportunities for men to be of service to greater causes than themselves, and that are actually providing men with systems, tools, resources where they can learn the psychological skills, the relational skills, the emotional skills, the financial skills, the career skills, where they can actually root more fully into their own value as a man.
mm,
And without that, men are going to continue to kill themselves at higher rates than women, to check out from jobs, to check out from society. That's going to continue to happen because I think what we're really seeing is in many ways, and I'm cautious about what I'm about to say because it can be misconstrued, but in many ways, we have to build boys into men. And there are ways to do that. But when we just leave young boys to try and figure out how to become a man, it it's brutal. It does not help them. It does not serve them. And that does not serve our community, it doesn't serve women, doesn't serve families or relationships or our culture or society. It is a bad recipe. And so we need to be able to offer them some of these systems, tools, processes to develop. It's the thing that I needed. I don't know about you,
me
but when
too.
I was 18, 19, 20, 25, all the way up to 30, it's like, damn, I could have used some of the things that are out there today to help me get my life together, to find some direction in my life, to stop just fucking hating myself,
Mm,
like I hated who I was. And there's nothing more heartbreaking and also nothing more damaging than a man who hates who he is. He's going to bleed that out into the world in more ways than one.
mm. Yeah, man. That pain of self-abandonment and repeating patterns and not even knowing why is a really painful process to be in. And you mentioned something earlier about men not trusting other men, for good reason, for whatever way they had experienced that letdown. And yet we're also here talking about the deep need for men to work with other men, particularly those who are further along, who've had more experience into maturity, into initiation. So how do we reconcile that internal distrust for men, somebody who's listening to this and maybe even recognizing, yeah, okay, there's parts of this for me that are landing, and I also struggle with that ability to actually show up and step into a space to be honest with men.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why men's work is so important. I
Mm,
think in order to heal the wounds that you have from men, you have to largely get in the arena with other men to disprove those old stories. to be able to work through the pain of, dad left when I was 10, or he was abusive, or he was there, but he was a ghost. I came up with this term called ghost dad that
Mm.
seems to resonate with a lot of men. Was like, your dad was there, but I didn't really know anything about him. I didn't really know him emotionally. He didn't really take an interest in me and my life. That's ghost dad, right? There, but not really. He's not tangible. There's nothing to grab onto. And this is the type of man that so many men in modern society were raised by, for one reason or another, And so I think in large part, we have to get around other men who are going to hold us accountable, who are going to love us, who are going to, stand by us as we go through hardship in life. One of my good friends and colleagues, Dewey Freeman, he's been a therapist for 40 plus years, and he's got this very simple saying about attachment, which is that attachment happens when you can go through a hard time with somebody else and come out the other side okay. So for a lot of men, the reason why we don't trust men is because when we went through a hard time with another guy, with another man, whether it was a father or a brother or a friend, we didn't come out the other side okay. The conflict would happen, the disagreement would happen, things would blow up. Maybe there was physical violence or emotional abuse or verbal abuse, and we wouldn't come out the other side okay, and nothing would get talked about. I can't tell you how many men have shared their stories with me. They were like, yeah, this big blow up happened with my dad. And then 2 days later, he was just, talking to me about the car and how, the brakes needed to be replaced, like nothing happened, and meanwhile, 2 days before that, he was like, beating me, and, we just never talked about it again. So I think we have to repair that by getting into relationship with other men where we can go through conflict, we can go through challenges, and we can repair the damage that's been done in either the absence of masculinity, the absence of male presence in our life, or the harm that we've experienced at the hands of other men. And
Mm.
as we do that, there's a type of repair that starts to happen within us, within our psyche, within our body, within our relationships. And it does something to how you relate to yourself as a man. Because the truth is, how do you as a man trust yourself if you don't trust men,
Hmm.
right? What you're really saying is, I don't trust myself as a man. I'm shady. I'm shifty, right? I'm not trustworthy. So, in order to really fully and deeply trust ourselves, we have to go on this kind of, Odyssey like journey of being able to trust other men again, of being able to share some of the challenges and the triumphs of our life in a way where they're met, they're not weaponized against us,
Hmm.
or, having a man grieve with us as we go through the loss of a parent or the death of a relationship or whatever it is. That is so damn important. So I would say that that's probably the biggest piece.
Yeah, 100%. It's changed my life, man, in so many ways. And just even entering into retreats in the early spaces, and these guys are often deer in the headlights, and then all of a sudden somebody kicks through the door with vulnerability, and then you ask the simple question: has anybody else experienced this? And as the hands go up, you can just feel a settling in the space. And I think what it's done for me to combat my internal shame and my internal narratives, in addition to the accountability, in addition to the mirror, has
Mm.
been absolutely incredible. I'm recognizing we're here on time. How can guys engage more with what you're doing? How do they find you?
Easiest way is just Man Talks, Mantalks, on YouTube. Got a couple 100,000 subscribers there. The channel has been growing on
Yeah.
Spotify, on Instagram. You can check out the Man Talks Alliance. We've got, I think by the end of this month, we'll probably have, 900 or 1,000 men from around the world that are part of that. And then you can check out the book, Men's Work. I like very simple and direct marketing. You can tell. I'm like, it's like, how would I want to be marketed to? Man Talks. This is about men talking. Men's Work. This is about men's doing the work. It's like, I like that type of blunt force trauma marketing. It seems to work, though. It seems to work. It's
It's
done pretty
working
well.
well. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love the simplicity. I love your approach, and all those things you just listed are amazing resources for any man. looking to become better for himself and for those around him. So thanks for the work you do, man. Thanks for taking the time. I appreciate you big time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.